Hello, I'm Andrew O'Hare, the executive editor of Salon. Welcome to Salon Talks. Today we have a first-time author of a new novel with us. And if you're thinking that we wouldn't ordinarily maybe do a segment with a first-time novelist, that could be true in some cases. You may recognize this particular author from some of his other endeavors. Joining me today is two-time Oscar winner, human rights activist, occasional journalist, if that's not an insult.
Only to journalists.
Only to journalists. Sean Penn, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And your book, which is on sale tomorrow, I believe, the March 27th, for those of you maybe not watching this live, is called Bob Honey Who Just Do Stuff. There's a lot of things I want to ask you about this book, Sean, but have you always kind of wanted to write a novel? Is this something that's been cooking for a long time?
Well, I had been writing from a pretty young age, and when I started acting in movies, I had a kind of embarrassed notion of publishing things because I guess culturally it seemed to me that there would be a scrutiny on it, not pure to the work. So I did send out some poetry to poetry journals in Europe and had some things published that way. Then I began to write I began writing short stories, really. And then when I moved on further in film out of this restriction I'd put on myself, I wrote a lot of screenplays and made films of those screenplays. Right. And I found that the process of writing was really the one I was happiest in. And so I think a lot of people tell themselves, you know, one day I'm going to write a novel. And I had been telling myself that for a very long time. And I suppose once I shed concern about perception, cultural perception, I heard the name Bob Honey in my head, and that clicked on the radio, and the music played.
It's a very funny, very dark book. I almost hesitate to ask this question. Tell the audience a little bit who Bob Honey is actually the guy's name, who is the main character in your book. Tell the audience a little bit about him.
Well, he's an entrepreneur. He has some of his background is confessed to in terms of his knowledge of physics and engineering, knowledge of explosives and otherwise weaponry. We don't know where all of that comes from, where all of that background comes from. His practical knowledge in terms of his business is in the septic tank industry, where he digs septic tanks and pumps septic tanks and so on. He's I guess it's taking the modern American man of a certain age, let's say one I'm familiar with, and putting him in the kind of quicksand of this very fast-moving social media era. An era that it seems when Norman Mailer wrote his book, Why We Are at War, the Iraq War. Yeah. He proposed this sensibility, which was that democracy is such a noble notion, and that against the natural instinct of our ugliest nature, human beings' ugliest nature. Mm-hmm. Fascism is actually a more likely model that we will move towards. And that democracy, therefore, is a very perishable thing. And that the paradox is that when we try to export democracy, we tend to bring more fascism to the United States and to the world. And so this dynamic with the quicksand of social media, of transactional relationships, to take somebody who has a kind of old school ethic and has a very committed moral code while violating it in parts of his professional life to what he considers a justifiable extreme. Right. All gathered together to be one more of these things that my children would see in me over the years and say, nobody laughs at your humor, Dad, like you do. And I needed a format where I could laugh a lot at my own humor, and that was alone writing. And then in this case, I gave it to a publisher, and I guess they thought it was funny too. So that's a first.
And there are a lot of themes in this book that, you know, echo things that you've been concerned about over the years. I mean, he goes to Iraq, to the Middle East, at about the time of the Bush administration's war there, the early 2000s. And I believe I'm correct that you went to Iraq around that same time, right?
I was there 2002 and 2003. Yeah.
Right, right. So are you drawing in some cases on specific things that you observed or experienced?
Yeah, I doubt more than most authors
Right.
do. You know, I've had the luxury of living a very diverse life, and so, and also because it's a public one, I suppose there'll be some recognition of that, of things I drew on from the book, but not in any ways that were literal to my own experience.
Right, right. And Bob's journey does echo all these you know, sort of political themes in our culture right now. I suppose you didn't exactly know when you were writing this it was going to be published in the second year of Donald Trump's presidency, but that seems like a very odd and deeply ironic illustration of the theme that you just mentioned about the attempted export of democracy maybe producing more fascism at home.
Fascism, divisiveness, I think that's really part of why rather than writing some kind of a political essay, you know, I have been in the middle of those arguments and those debates many times, and maybe even at times considered a lightning rod on certain issues. And I really felt that this is, you know, this is a book that anybody can read, if only those who may be predisposed to loathe it simply because of its authorship. If they then still read it, I would suggest that they treat it as their drunk uncle, that they see once, see here, and that they still have a colorful conversation with it. And that's the idea, is that this is something that, with a little sense of humor, anybody can read. It's not an opinion piece. And so that's it. That was the motivation to write Bob Honey Who Just Do Stuff.
And I feel like, you know, it's in some ways I said earlier, it's a very funny book in places. It's certainly farcical. It's larger than life at times. The language and the music of the language, something I want to talk about in a second, is very strong. But in a certain way, and it took me a while to figure this out, you're not entirely making fun of Bob. He's not entirely like an object of sport. Is that fair?
Oh, absolutely. Because there's also something, you know, common in our pursuit to rediscover our innocence. There's something in our idealism that, as we get older, gets chipped away at. I was thinking recently about, you know, in my own case, that it wasn't just that within days of this horrible shooting in Parkland that these kids came out and spoke with so much articulation. They spoke with exactly the kind of embrace of others, including the ideas that were opposed to them, that we would want our leaders to speak with. And to see young people do that, and do that after having been in the shock and horror of the cracking sound that those kinds of weapons make indoors or in concrete hallways, are something that everybody should experience outside of television. Not in the way they did, you know, I hope, but it's something to understand what the violence of that machine is. And for them to come out from that kind of a traumatic circumstance and seeing their friends killed and injured, and be so ready to talk to everyone about it, is this thing that can give you a little bit of hope. My book is only, you know, pales in comparison in the sense that it's just offering a giggle within hopelessness.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was really, I mean, everybody, the whole country's been thinking about the Parkland thing, and seeing what happened this weekend with thousands of young people and their parents, in many cases, in every major city in the U.S., speaking out on something that has had the entire political system paralyzed for years now. Is that is that legitimate hope? Do you see legitimate hope there?
Well, I mean, I think there's only legitimate hope on this basis. When the town hall was done on this issue on CNN, for example, it seemed to me that CNN might have chosen not to do commercial breaks. But the commercial breaks that happened do indicate that when BMW or others decide this story is not competitive with what's on Fox, that it will go away unless, and this is beginning, what happened is the women that were starting, the founders of the Women's March, collaborated with this youth movement. Now, if that collaboration moves into multiple issues and not just guns, that then is the ballot box, because you're going to divide and divide on guns for a long time. But that does seem to be a hopeful thing.
There's some I'm not sure if I'm paraphrasing this right. I looked this up. It's on page 15, I think. You have this comment in Bob's voice, or his internal monologue, about the media, its ability, maybe it can't tell people exactly what to think, but it tells them, it's successful at telling them what to think about. Is that sort of a fair paraphrase? Is that a fair representation of the way that you see the problem with the media in this country, which you've been outspoken about at times?
Well, I think that, for example, I could quickly name journalists who I think in their skill sets operate on the highest level, whether they be in print journalists or television journalists or commentators, anchor people, reporters in the field. What we find, though, is that producers who are influenced by their advertisers in this country, particularly in the mainstream media, you're going to have an enormous amount of focus on those competitive stories, and very monocultural, or monocultural in the effect of them. And so we get such a narrow view. It's always one of the things about Bob Honey that made it fun to write is that, unlike about 75% of most Americans, he has a passport.
Right.
And he also therefore must have enough funds to travel with that passport. So I love the idea of a guy who really has seen it from every perspective, and he's still not worldly.
Right. That's an interesting observation. I feel like there is that subset of Americans, maybe some of them in the media, some of them in the intelligence community, some of them in the military, who have been to other places around the world but still remain in a very, America-centric, very nationalistic mindset, right?
Yes, and also what you find in the intelligence community, again, separate, is that people, whether they be Republican, Democrat, whatever their devout Christians, so on and so forth. That you have people with, mostly operating with very high intelligence, so personal intelligence,
sure,
who have actually such a deep understanding of the context of other places and peoples, a deep enough one to never be in the kind of divisive arguments that we have in the media. That the media has still not broken the back of that, to talk to people so that you have at the center of it knowledgeable, experienced people who simply differ in opinion, but they don't differ because of ignorance. And I've had some of my most engaged conversations are things that were influential on whatever part of this novel that relates to that world is based on extraordinary people with extraordinary commitment to service, from whom one can learn a lot.
So one of the things that really struck me just reading it is the amount of alliteration and internal rhyming. Was this you sitting there, did you speak this novel, or did you write it on paper? Because it feels often like song or poetry in terms of the internal rhythms.
There were three ways that I wrote. Dominantly, sitting on a couch, smoking a cigarette, dictating. Secondly, pacing around that couch, smoking a cigarette, dictating. And thirdly, longhand at night, when things would strike me and I didn't have access to my computer-savvy assistant. who was able to keep up with me in the days. So then, and that was, yeah, it was pretty, it was very, well, most of it dictated.
Because the alliteration maybe is the most striking of all. Was that like a deliberate choice, something that you wanted to kind of keep doing once you found it, or did it come up completely?
Yeah, I thought that you know, there's something in the language of daily life that seems to hold words captive. We have shorthands with each other. We have the way we talk in text messages, unfortunately. And I think it sort of gets blinding to and so I wanted to push the words to, again, you know, a ridiculous level.
Right, right. It's a lot of fun, which is kind of difficult thing to say about a novel that also has a fair amount of violence and darkness and maybe a scabrous portrayal of American and international reality. But I did enjoy reading it a lot. I hope other people will too. And this is Sean Penn, Oscar winner for Mystic River and Milk. I have that right? Those are the two things he won the award for. Screenwriter and director on other occasions, human rights activist, journalist who did the famous interview with El Chapo, and now the author of the novel Bob Honey, Who Just Do Stuff, which is on sale this week. From who's your publisher, Sean?
It's Atria, Simon & Schuster.
Right, Simon & Schuster, Atria. Sean Penn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much.